Amen. Great job, guys.
This morning, glad you didn't fall temptation to the beautiful weather and the holiday and everything, and you made it out. So glad you could join us. So I hope you enjoy the holiday too, and enjoy time, whatever it is you got going on this weekend. If you're going to spend some time with family and friends, or spend time relaxing, whatever you're going to do, enjoy it. So we are getting to the end of our Empowering Return series. This is the second to last week. Next week will be the last week. So we have 2 more weeks we're going to finish up. And just a reminder, too, if you've missed any of the past ones and you want to catch up, or even if there's one that you just maybe think you need to hear again, you can go to our YouTube page, and all the sermons are on there. You can go there and you can catch back up, or catch one that you missed, or get a second listen if maybe you think you need a second listen. So they're all there. We started back on Easter, and we are coming up to the end here. So this week, we are going to be looking at meekness. And for my picture that I put up here with the water, I picked the water for a reason, because I thought it was kind of a good analogy for what we're going to look at here with meekness. Because water, if you've been on the water before, just because it looks nice and calm like that picture, doesn't always mean the water is very calm. Sometimes it looks calm, and then you get out there and realize it's not very calm at all, or there's a bunch of stuff going on beneath the surface. Sometimes even you get out in the deep oceans and that, and you're on those big boats. If you've been on like a cruise ship, or maybe if you were in the Navy on one of these big ones, there would be waves going underneath you, but maybe you didn't even notice it. So it seems like it's calm just because you're on that big boat, but you didn't even notice the waves. But this is what we're going to see. This is a good analogy for us, a good example we're going to see of meekness, because just because it's calm doesn't always mean that there's not other stuff going on. Just because the surface looks like that doesn't mean that's what everything means. And just because we're talking about meekness, it doesn't mean it's weakness. So, just like this water, meekness is misunderstood sometimes. And in fact, I think meekness can be one of the most misunderstood words we have in the fruit of the Spirit that we've been looking at. Because most of these, when you look at them, love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance, a lot of those we have a pretty good idea on. And a lot of those, even we use those words often. Love and joy and peace, we understand those. Patience even. We understand stuff like that well. Meekness, sometimes we have a hard time understanding what it's actually talking about here, and what the Bible wants us to understand. Sometimes we think that we understand it, but we're a little bit off on what the Bible is actually trying to communicate. And if this happened to you, or you've seen someone, that can cause more problems. When you think you understand something, and you start doing something, and you start using a word, and then you don't actually understand it, that causes all kinds of problems, doesn't it? We've seen those jokes about someone that was texting something, and they used some little acronym because they thought it meant one thing, and it meant the complete opposite thing of what they thought. Right? That causes problems sometimes, doesn't it? So sometimes we think we understand meekness, but we don't actually understand what the Bible is telling us about meekness. And this confusion comes around because the world's definition of meekness doesn't equal what the Bible is talking about here. See, the world looks at meekness and they see that as a bad thing, a negative thing, a thing that you don't want in your life. And so I Googled meekness this week just to see what kind of definitions I would find. And these are some of the words that I found when I looked for a definition of meekness. Deficient in courage, weak, docile, overly compliant, spiritless, easily imposed on. Not a lot of things that we would probably want ourselves described at, is it? Most of those are kinds of things we wouldn't want to have someone describe us as. Overly compliant, or spiritless, or weak, deficient in courage. That's not something we want to have said about us. And so this is what the world understands meekness as, and they look at these as bad things, because what does the world tell you how you should live your life? The world is telling you need to push ahead and push for the things that you want to do or the things that you like. What you want, you should go get them. Do what you think is right. You go ahead, push other people out of the way. If you enjoy it, you should go do it. How do you get it? And how does the world say you get ahead in life? You have to get ahead by pushing back the people that are around you and stepping past those people. That's how you get ahead. You got to work and push those people out of the way, and you got to do what's best for you. You look out for yourself. You do what you want. When what you want in your life, you get it. And that's what the world tells us, isn't it? And they say that's how you should live your life. So that makes sense. When they look at meekness and they see it saying deficient in courage and weak and docile, that's why the world looks at meekness and says that's not something you want to have in your life. Because that's not how you're going to get ahead. That's not how you're going to succeed in life, is by having those characteristics in your life. So that makes sense. And of course, that definition, that the way the world looks at it, that filters into us too, because we're in the world, aren't we? And that's what we learn too, is that meekness is not a good thing that you need to have in your life. And the world is telling us all these things too about how to get ahead and how to succeed. But how do we match that up with the fact that God says this should be something that's in your life, and this should be something that characterizes your life? And we need to look at that and understand that something's not matching up here, because if meekness is such a bad thing, why is God saying this should be a part of your life? And he specifically points that out as things that should characterize your life as a Christian. So we need to not look at meekness with what our modern definition of it is, but we need to look and see, how does the Bible define meekness? What is the biblical definition of meekness? And see what the Bible says about it. Because that's the only way we're going to understand what God is trying to get out of us. So we're going to go through several different verses here and a few different passages, trying to understand first, what is meekness? Because if we're going to say we need to have meekness in our life, and we're going to see what happens when we have meekness in life, we need to make sure we understand it. Because this, as we said, is probably the most misunderstood word in the fruit of the Spirit. So we need to remember, right, the Bible was not written in English, first off. It was written in different languages, and even if it was written in English, you ever remember in school or anything, maybe you saw one of those old English poems from 1,000 years ago? That might as well be in a different language, right? So even if it was written in English, considering it's been a couple thousand years, we probably wouldn't be able to understand it anyway. So we need to remember it was written in different languages and translated into English. So when we look at the words used in meekness in the Bible and what they mean in their original language, we see things like this: mildness of disposition and gentleness of spirit. So, kind of similar to some of the words we were looking at, but it doesn't have a lot of the negative aspects to it, does it? Where before, the definitions we're looking at now is all pointing out the negative parts of this definition. The definition we see in the Bible doesn't really hit on those negative parts, but it does talk about mildness and gentleness. And a good way to sum it up that we're going to see is what we have up here. Acceptance and submission to another's will is a good way to sum up meekness. Now, when you're a Christian, when you have God in your life, that acceptance and submission to another's will, that another is God. So you can switch that another out with God. Meekness is acceptance and submission to God's will in your life. And so we're going to go through this and understand what that means and see how we're going to accept and submit to God's will with meekness. The first thing I want to look at, we're going to look through a little bit of Psalm chapter 37. We read one of the verses in the scripture reading already, Psalm 37:11. And that said, "But the meek shall inherit the earth and shall delight themselves in the abundance of peace." Okay, so meek shall inherit the earth. Now, if you're looking Psalm 37, if you go back a couple verses, verse 9, David, who wrote this psalm, says this: "For evildoers shall be cut off, but those that wait upon the Lord, they shall inherit the earth." So the two verses apart here, we see two different instances where it's saying people are going to inherit the earth. Now, just because the Bible, it has two things that have the same outcome like this, it doesn't always mean it's the same. But when we look at this chapter here, we can see it's all in one chapter. It's just two verses apart. And we look at the whole context that we're going to see in a second here, I think we can say that it's the same, that David is talking about the same thing here. that those that are waiting upon the Lord will inherit the earth, and the meek will inherit the earth. I think he's talking about the same thing here. And throughout the beginning of this chapter here, David is taking two different kinds of people, and he's kind of comparing them. What he calls evildoers and those that are waiting upon the Lord. And in verse 9 that we read, he says, he's talking about evildoers, and he talks about those that wait upon the Lord. And then you go to verse 10, he's talking about evildoers again. And then in verse 11, he's talking about someone inheriting the earth again, the meek this time, instead of calling them meek, instead of waiting upon the Lord. So I think he's talking about the same people, going back and forth, comparing them. When you go back to the beginning of the chapter, 1 and 2, he mentions those evildoers again. And then he starts 3 through 8, which we're going to look at here, talking about what he's calling those that wait upon the Lord. So as we're trying to figure out what meekness means and what it should look like in our lives, we can look at these verses, I think, and help us get a better understanding of it. So we're going to go through a couple of these verses one at a time. Verse 3 in Psalm 37 says, "Trust in the Lord and do good. So shalt thou dwell in the land, and verily thou shalt be fed." So what does meekness look like in your life? First off, trusting in the Lord. A deep confidence that God is for you and that he's not against you. That's the first step, is putting your trust fully in God. God, I trust you. I'm with you. I'm confident that you're going before me, and so I'm going to follow you with my life. So trust in the Lord. Verse 4, "Delight thyself also in the Lord. He shall give thee the desires of thine heart." So after trusting in God, you see a happiness in the Lord working through you, that you're glad to have God in your life. You're thankful to have God in your life. You're happy that he's in your life, and you're happy and thankful and glad, delighting even, that he is working in your life and using your life to accomplish his will. So we're trusting him. Now we're thankful to have him in our life and working through us, and we're happy even to have him working through us. Verse 5 and 6 says, "Commit thy way unto the Lord, trust also in him, and he shall bring it to pass. And he shall bring forth thy righteousness as the light, and thy judgment as the noonday." So commit thy way into the Lord. This, when it's talking about commit, what that means, it's giving us a picture of taking your burdens, your anxieties, your worries that you have in your life right now, and putting them onto God. To take them, all those things that are weighing you down, and we're going to roll those onto God and let God hold those for us. We're not going to have those be pulling us down anymore. We're going to put our trust on God and let him do it. So we're trusting in him. We're accepting him into our life. We're saying, God, you're with me, and I'm going to go with you. I'm going to be happy to go with you, and I'm going to take these problems that come into my life as they go, and I'm going to put them on you and let you carry them, and let you help me get through. Verse 7, "Rest in the Lord, and wait patiently for him. Fret not thyself because of him who prospereth in his way, because of the man who bringeth wicked devices to pass." Patiently waiting for God's leading and direction. We should be patiently waiting for God's leading and direction in our life. Now, the way that we can do that, though, is by taking the first couple verses we've already looked at. Because you can't really be patiently waiting for God's direction and guidance in your life if you haven't already said, God, I'm going to trust you. Hey, I'm trusting you're going to take care of me, and I'm going to be happy to do your will and do your work in my life. And God, I'm going to take all these things that are weighing me down and holding me back, and I'm going to put them on you. When you can do those first couple things, that's when you can get to this point here where you're saying, okay, I'm going to wait, God, and I'm going to trust you. You're going to lead and direct me and guide me, and I'm going to be patient to do it. So, see, we have to take all these things together. They all work together. You can't just take one part out of it and do it. You've got to take all of these if we're going to have this meekness in our life. That's what we're talking about here. We're not going to be worried about what the world is doing and what the world has going on around us. Instead, we're focused on what God is doing in our lives. Not worried about what the world is telling us and all this stuff that's going on around us. Instead, I'm going to focus on God, and I'm going to wait on him, and I'm going to wait for his guidance and direction in my life. Because this is really hard with our culture, because we have so much stuff hitting us all the time, right? Between social media and the internet and TV and all the media around us, right? They're hitting us with all kinds of stuff all the time, telling you, like we said, how you should live your life, the way that you get ahead in life, the things that you should be doing, and telling us all kinds of this other stuff. We have all this stuff that's hitting us all the time. And when we can get our trust on God and our focus on God, and we're saying, I'm going to follow you, and I'm going to wait for your guidance, that is how we can start to filter some of that stuff out. Without that focus on God, it's really hard to filter out all this other stuff that's hitting us all the time, and that's pulling us down, and trying to put more of those anxieties and worries and burdens on our lives. Because a lot of the stuff that's hitting us from the world, that's adding more of those things onto us, more burdens on us that we're trying to figure out. And we're trying to get rid of those, and we're trying to put those on God. So we need to focus on God and not be focusing on all this other stuff that's trying to pull us down. Verse 8, cease from anger and forsake wrath. Fret not thyself in any wise to do evil. So keeping yourself calm in spite of what others are doing. Okay, again, you got to take all this other stuff that we've already been talking about, and that's got to be in your life first before you can really do this, doesn't it? To stay calm when others are attacking you and others are putting you down and treating you badly, trying to stay calm in spite of what they're saying about you and doing to you, that takes a lot of this trust in God and focus on Him and being patient on Him. So let's look at the example that we have in the Bible of Moses. This is in Numbers 12. We're not going to read through the story. We're going to sum it up a little bit. But in this passage, Numbers 12, Moses is described as the meekest man that's on the earth, which is a pretty interesting description. He's the meekest man on the earth. And in chapter 12, we have the story of his brother and sister, Aaron and Miriam. It's not just any random person. This is his brother and sister come to Moses. And they start getting upset at Moses. And you know when you get upset at someone and you just start picking at any little thing, even if it doesn't matter to what you're upset at? You know what I mean? That they start doing that with Moses. They're picking at him because they're mad at him. And they are mad that God uses Moses differently than God is using them. That's really what they're upset about. They see what things that God is doing through Moses, and they're like, we should be doing those things too. So they're getting mad because God is not using them like He's using Moses. They start talking about Moses and picking at him and talking down about him. And so Moses, the meekest man on the earth, here's what we see. Do we see him get back up and start chirping back at Aaron and Miriam? No, Moses stays quiet and stays calm and stays silent. And because, again, what does the world tell you? When someone is coming at you and someone's putting you down and someone is offending you or disrespecting you or whatever, what should you do? You need to stand up and defend yourself, right? You need to get up there and you need to go right back at them. That's what the world tells us. But Moses, we see Moses, the meekest man in the earth, we see him do something the opposite. He instead stays quiet. And at least from the account that we're given in Numbers 12 here, he doesn't say anything. And what happens is God Himself actually calls Moses and Aaron and Miriam to Him. And God rebukes Aaron and Miriam for the way that they've been acting and says, I'm using Moses like this because he's the one who's following me and he's the one who's been trusting me and he's the one I want to use. And Aaron and Miriam, you're not God. You need to stay in your place, basically. And he's saying, I've used Moses because that's who I want to use. And so what we see Moses doing here, which is an aspect of this meekness, is he's letting God defend him. Instead of trying to stand up and chirp back and talk back and making the situation worse and escalating the situation, instead he's standing back and he's staying quiet and he's saying, I'm going to let God defend me because I trust that God will. Now, there's one thing we need to notice that's important. We should stand up and defend God and defend what is right and what God has said is right. Now, there's a difference here. There's a difference between standing up for what is right and standing up for God and standing up for ourselves. See, Moses here is choosing not to stand up in this instance for himself and fight back, but instead let God fight back. But when it comes time, when someone is attacking God, we need to stand up for what is right. A great example is Jesus, the story we all know, when he throws the people out of the temple or the synagogue that are doing things they shouldn't be doing. He's standing up for what's right and standing up for God there. So when it's time to stand up for God, it's time to stand up for God. But Moses here, instead of defending him, choosing to defend himself and stand up for himself and fight back, he's saying, I'm going to let God fight my battles for me. because God's going to do a much better job of it than I ever will. And so this meekness is part of that as well. This say, I'm going to let God fight my battles. And so sometimes that's why the world sees us as being weak, because we're saying, I'm choosing to let God defend me, and I'm choosing to let this pass, and I'm going to let God do it. And so the world sometimes sees that and says think that's weakness, but that's what we're being called to do here. In James 1:19 through 21, it says this: Wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. For the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. Wherefore, lay apart all filthiness and superfluity of naughtiness, and receive with meekness the engrafted word, which is able to save your soul. So, what this verse is telling us, meekness means being quick to listen, slow to speak, eager to learn, does not immediately get angry when we hear something that we don't like, and being teachable. That's what we find here in this verse, is telling us what meekness is supposed to be like. So if you have meekness in your life, these things should characterize your life. Being quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger, being willing to be teachable. When we hear something that we don't like, that we immediately don't get upset and angry and yell back, but instead trying to take a step back and say, is this something that I need to fight or not? And again, like we mentioned, it's hard, because we talked about the media that we have in our culture. This is the exact opposite of media, isn't it? Because all we see all the time, if you're watching TV or you're online or anything, we see these headlines coming out that are meant to make us upset and are meant to get us worked up. And people are arguing back and forth all the time, especially when you're looking online, right? How many times you go online and you see people who don't even know each other arguing back and forth? And so it's really hard when we have this all around us and we're inundated with this all the time, the way that this anger back and forth. But what we see here is just telling us, you need to be the opposite of that. You need to be slow to speak and quick to open your ears. You need to listen to people first. Listen to what they're saying, their point of view. That doesn't always mean that their point of view is right, but you need to be at least willing to listen and talk to people about it calmly, not the anger and the yelling back and forth. Because when that anger and yelling back and forth, no one's listening, are they? Everyone's just trying to yell on their own side, and that just makes things worse and worse. And so we need to be quick to listen to what other people are saying, willing to admit that maybe we're wrong, because we make mistakes sometimes, don't we? Sometimes we're wrong. We don't like to say that, but sometimes we are wrong. And sometimes when we're willing to listen instead of just yell, we realize I was wrong here, and there is something I need to change. But also that's slow to speak, because what happens when you have those arguments? If you have been married for any amount of time, you can probably definitely relate to this, but even if you haven't been, and just any kind of relationship you have in your life, a friendship or anything, how often have you been mad and you immediately said something, and as soon as it came out of your mouth, you said, that was not something I should have said? We've all been there, haven't we? And we have those things come out of our mouth so quick, we don't even think about what it's saying or how it's going to affect someone. And so even though we might immediately say, I shouldn't have said that, I shouldn't have said, mentioned that shouldn't have been something that came out of my mouth, you can't put it back, can you? And so that's still out there, and it sticks with people sometimes. Those words that we say stick with people. Even when we only said it because we were mad and we didn't really mean it, it still sticks with people. And it's hard to get it back. So that's why we need to be slow to speak and quick to open up our ears and quick to listen to what other people might have going on in their lives. So we have just a couple more passages we're going to look at. Ephesians chapter 4, 1 through 3. It says, I, therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you that you walk worthy of the vocation wherewith you are called, with all lowliness and meekness, with long-suffering, forbearing one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. So Paul's writing here, and this is what he's telling us. He's telling us that we need to walk worthy of the calling that God has placed on your life. Whatever the calling he has, because God has placed a calling in every one of our lives, and he's called you to do something. So whatever that is, he's saying walk worthy of that. And you might say, well, how do I do that? Well, he tells us right here. How do you walk worthy of the calling that God's put in your life? He says you need to do that with humility, meekness, patience, love, and unity. So if you're going to walk worthy of the calling God's placed in your life, if you're going to follow through on what he wants you to do and do it in a way that's going to please God, he says these things have to be a part of your life. Humility, meekness, peace, unity, love. Those all need to be part of your life if you're going to follow him. And when you look at these words and really start to think about it, they're all related. They all work together. If you're going to have some of these in your life, you got to get all of them in there to make it really work. If you're just going to say, well, I'll be really humble, but I'm not going to be anything else, it's not going to work, is it? Or, I can just do this by myself. I don't need anyone else or any of this unity. I'll do it by myself. It's not going to work. You got to put all these words together, and they all work together to be able to go through and to follow the calling that God has placed in your life. So if you're going to follow through on what he wants you to do, meekness has to be a part of it. It has to be a part of your life and characterizing your life. One more verse we're going to look at is 1 Peter 3:15. It says, but sanctify the Lord God in your heart, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. So one more way to have meekness, and reason we need to have meekness in our life, is so that we can tell people and show people the hope that we have in God. Because as we already said, the world looks at meekness as a bad thing, a negative thing. And so when we have these characteristics in our life that we've been talking about, slow to speak, quick to listen, trusting God, waiting patiently for his guidance, happy to have him in our life, things like that, that is not what the world looks at as the normal thing. And so the world's going to look at you and say, this is unnatural. The way that this person is living doesn't make any sense to me. And the world's going to see that and not understand it. They're not going to be able to connect that. If you don't have God in your life, you're not going to be able to understand why you would choose to live that way. And so sometimes someone may not actually say anything to us, but there might even be times when someone comes up to you and says, why are you living this way? What's different about you? He's saying you need to be ready to give them an answer. And you need to be able to give them an answer with meekness. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, how many of us like someone to come up to us and just immediately tell us how bad and terrible of a person we are? No one likes that, do we? What if someone comes up and says that to you? Are you going to listen to them? Probably not. You're going to probably pretty quickly shut them out, aren't you? Say, I don't want to listen to this. I don't want to listen to someone telling me how bad of a person I am. So he's telling us when someone's coming up and talking to us, or when we're approaching someone else, and we're going to tell them about God, and we're going to tell them about the hope that we have through him, we have to be able to do it with meekness. And we have to be able to not come up there with a Bible and metaphorically hitting them over the head with a Bible, but we need to be able to come up and with meekness tell them about God in their life. Tell them about how we trust him. Tell them about the way that God has helped us before and brought us through our problems. Tell them how we can take those worries and anxieties that we're having and we're able to put them on God. And that's the reason why it seems like we're not worried about them anymore. That we can talk to people and tell them, this is who God is, and this is why I have him in my life. Now, there's a time for everything, right? And sometimes you do have to be maybe a little bit more forceful with someone. And that's just how it works. We all are a little bit different, and we all hear things differently. And there may be a time where you got to maybe come out a little more and be a little more forceful. I understand that. God understands that. God knows that. We're all different. One of the really cool things, if you look at the Gospels and the way that Jesus does all these miracles, sometimes there's different miracles that he did to people where he healed something, a very similar thing. He healed people that were blind, but when he did it in different ways. He didn't always heal someone who had the same problem the exact same way. And that's because he knew that they were different people and they maybe needed to be reached in a different way. So we sometimes need to keep that in mind. There's a time that maybe we need to be a little bit more forceful, but there's also a time where we need to approach this with meekness. that there's going to be there'll be people in your life that as soon as you say the word God or the Bible or take a Bible and open it up, they're out. And they're going to say, I'm not listening to this. There was someone this week who was here, and I was talking to them and said that thing. He was wanted to be a good example of God and tried to witness to someone. And he said as soon as anything about God gets brought up, the person is done. He's like, I'm not listening anymore. And so sometimes we need to be able to, with meekness, approach that. And instead of taking the Bible, like I said, and hitting them over the head, we need to be able to talk to them with meekness and say, hey, start telling them about your life. And as you're telling them about your life, you start saying, putting God in there. Telling them, this is the God that I have in my life, and this is why I trust Him and follow and obey Him. So we have to be able to have that meekness when we're sharing that hope that we have through God with people. Because as we go through time, the world turns more and more away from God and things of God, don't they? And the more and more people you'll find that they are ready to shut off as soon as anything about God gets brought up. So we need to be able to talk to them in more than one way and make sure that we can do it with meekness as well as be forceful when it's needed to be forceful. We need to share the truth in love. And too often we forget the in love part. We're too worried about sharing the truth and making sure that we share that truth, but we don't do it lovingly, meekly, in a way that people are able to listen to sometimes. So we ought to be meek because God has called us to be meek, right? Obviously, we've been talking about that with the fruit of the Spirit. But this whole series, Empowering Returns, talking about not just what God is saying it should be in our life, but also we've been talking about the why it should be in our life and what's going to happen when we have it in our life. So what is going to be the results of meekness in our life? If we can take this meekness that we've been talking about and we can make it a part of our life and take all these different parts and make that a regular thing in our life and a regular part of our character, what is going to happen? What are we going to find in our life? First off, we see that the Bible tells us meekness leads to wisdom. Listen to this, in James 3:13, James writes, "Who is a wise man and endued with knowledge among you? Let him show out of a good conversation his works with meekness of wisdom." You see that a wise man shows you he's wise with his actions. And those actions are going to have meekness be a part of it. We've all met people who like to tell people how smart they are and how wise they are, haven't we? And usually, are they the smartest person? Not usually. So usually if someone's real interested in telling us how smart they are and how wise they are, that usually means they're not that smart in life. And so what it's telling us here is people that have this wisdom in their life, that are truly wise, they're going to show it to you not with their mouth telling you about how wise they are, but instead with their actions. And James writes here that those actions are going to exhibit this meekness that we've been talking about. And even in a couple verses down, we look at it, James tells you exactly what this wisdom is going to look like if you get this wisdom in your life. Verse 17 says, "But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruit, without partiality and without hypocrisy." So, peaceful, gentle, willing to listen, merciful. Does this sound familiar at all? This is all the same things that we've just been looking at, the same that's describing meekness. So all these words that we see and all these verses that we've seen that are trying to give us a picture of what meekness looks like in our life, James here is taking all those same things and saying you're going to have wisdom in your life. Wisdom is going to be exhibited in your life. These are the things that are going to show people that you're wise by having these same characteristics. You want to be someone who is looked at as being wise, that makes good decisions, that is doing the right thing. We're telling us here, you need to get meekness in your life. You need to get these things in your life. And when you have that in your life, that will show people that you're making a good decision. So going back again to those two verses we read in our scripture reading from Psalm 37:11 and Matthew 5:5. The meek shall inherit the earth. See, the last thing here, we're looking at this. Yeah, weakness gives us wisdom, but meek will inherit the earth. What does that mean? Well, in Matthew 5, it starts what we call today the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is giving it. And right at the beginning there, Jesus is saying some things that we call today the Beatitudes. And the meek shall inherit the earth is right in those Beatitudes. And so Jesus is coming, and in this section, Jesus is teaching how he came to bring a different way to live, and a different way to do things. Where in the Old Testament, under the law, it was very strict in that law, and really black and white on things. And Jesus is trying to tell us, I'm doing something different, and I'm bringing you grace and mercy and love, and offering you an ability to have a relationship with God. And so he's telling us this in this section of the Sermon on the Mount here as he's starting out. And he's trying to show us all this, and he's telling us about this meekness right in the middle of it. So think back to what we said meekness was at the beginning. Acceptance is submission to another, God's will. When we can accept God into our life, and we're willing to submit to him and allow his leading in our life, the Bible tells us that God adopts us into his family, and he makes us as one of his own. And we become a part of God's family when we accept him into our life. God, the creator, the ruler of all powerful. So when we belong to him, that God that is the creator of everything, the ruler of all, when we belong to him, we no longer have to worry so much about what's going to happen to us, or where we're going to go, or what's going to happen when we leave this earth. Because we have the trust that we have in God. We've accepted him, and we've submitted to him. And we can trust that he's going to guide us and lead us and direct us to where we need to go. And that he's creating a place for us, so that when we do leave this earth, we know that we will be with him. And we know that we will get that inheritance through him. And so we're given freedom through that. When we can accept God and submit to him through meekness, we're actually given freedom. See, a lot of times people look at it as like giving up their freedom, or that there's going to be chained down or something when you try to follow God in your life, and when you're submitting to him and accepting him and following him. Feel like you're being pulled down and pulled back, but instead is actually offering us freedom. Because we're able to say, I'm going to follow God and let him guide me and direct me. And now I don't have to have those stresses and anxieties and burdens that pull down on us about what am I going to do, which way do I go, what's right, where should I go with my life. Because now we're just following God and we're letting him guide us. And so we're able to take, like we said, take those burdens and anxieties and worries and roll them onto him and say, all right, I'm putting these on you, God, and I'm just going to patiently wait for your leading. And that gives us freedom now, because we know that God is going to go in front of us and we can just follow him. There was a trip I was on when I was a college student and with a group, and we had gone on a road trip, and we were coming back, and we were driving through the snow, and the snow was almost going sideways across the highway. Now, and I was driving the car that was in front, and I had several cars that were behind me and following me, and it was stressful because I was looking at it that all these people that are behind me and following me, they're trusting that I'm going to go the right speed and a safe speed, and I'm going to get them all home safely because they're following me. I was in front. And it was a lot of stress on me because I was worried about this and didn't want people to get in accidents or anything to happen in the snow. And it was hard work trying to figure out what was going to be right, because I had to do it all on my own. Now, the people that were behind me, there was still some stress on snow because because anytime you're driving in snow like that where it's blowing sideways across the road, it's a little stressful, isn't it? But they were following me, and they were trusting me to go the right speed and to make the right decision. So yeah, they still had some stress, but definitely wasn't what I was feeling up front leading the way. And so when we can submit to God, it's just like that. And that's how we're given the freedom. Because God is the one who's in the front, and God is the one that's leading the way and guiding and directing us and making the decisions about what is going to be safe or not and what's going to get us to the right destination. And so we're behind God. We're in the cars behind him, just going along. Yeah, there's still some stress sometimes. There's still some worries sometimes in this life, and difficulties and hard times. But when we're trusting that God is in that car in front of us and leading the way and doing so safely, now we're able to take some of that stress and put it on Him because we're willing to follow Him. And we're willing to let Him take the lead and make the decision. And so that's how we're given that freedom when we follow Him. That it's not bondage, that it's not slavery, that it's not being pulled down and held back. Instead, we're given freedom by choosing to follow Him and obey Him. We don't have to get caught up in all the fighting back and forth that we see in this world that goes on all around us, because we're able to put that away and focus on God instead. And we're able to patiently wait for Him, like we talked about. So, why be meek? Why do we make this part of our life? Why did God include it in the fruit of the Spirit that we've been studying for the past several weeks? Because when we are truly meek, as we see here described in the Bible, we can trust and rely on God to provide for us, to protect us, to guide us. And all this can only come when we have a relationship with God. When we take that first part, the accepting Him into our life. We talked about accepting and submitting to Him. We have to accept Him into our life. We have to have that relationship with Him. If we don't have that relationship with Him, we can't be guiding or letting Him guide us and following Him and letting Him take on these burdens that we've talked about. We have to get that relationship part right first. And so if you don't have a relationship with God, we would love to talk to you more about that and try to explain what that means more. And we're going to have a time of invitation in a few minutes, and so you're welcome to come up front if you want to do that, or we can talk after service and do that. We'd love to explain to you about what it means to have a relationship with God. But if you do already have that relationship with God, you have to take that next step, that not just have the relationship, but now say, I'm going to submit to you, God. I'm going to follow you. I'm going to trust in you. I'm going to let you fight my battles for me. I'm going to let you go first, and I'll follow you. And so that is why we need to have this meekness in our life. That's what is going to come in our life when we can make it a part of it. We can have that freedom of following God. We can have that wisdom that only comes from God. We won't get those things without it. Because as we saw, we were looking at these, all these things work together, didn't they? They all fit together so that they all work with each other to add this meekness in our life. So first, get the relationship. Second, work on that submission. That is the only way you're going to get this in your life. Lord, we come to you and thank you for all the things you do for us, the ways you provide for us.